If you really stop and look at the grand arc of human history, it bears this uncanny resemblance to a massive multiplayer strategy game.
Oh, like a video game.
Yeah, exactly. Think about the mechanics of a game like Civilization.
Right, where you start with nothing.
Exactly. You spawn onto this dark, unexplored map as just a tiny, vulnerable band of hunter-gatherers.
And your only real objective at that point is just avoiding starvation.
Right. You're moving from tile to tile, you're foraging, hunting, basically just trying to survive the winter. But then this fundamental shift happens.
You figure out a few hidden mechanics in the environment.
Yeah, you click the right buttons on the tech tree, and suddenly the game completely changes.
It's not about surviving anymore.
No, suddenly you were building the pyramids of Giza. You've got standing armies, complex taxation brackets, rigid social classes.
Written laws dictating the behavior of millions of people.
Exactly. It is the ultimate leveling up process for humanity.
And what's so fascinating is how abrupt that transition really is, in the grand scheme of time.
Oh, it's a blink of an eye.
It really is. I mean, for hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived in these small egalitarian bands, and then suddenly we're paving roads and inventing bureaucracy.
Which brings up the massive underlying question for you, the listener, as we jump into today's deep dive. Why did we do it?
Right. Why change the formula if hunter-gathering was working?
Exactly. If humanity really is playing this grand strategy game, what are the actual hard-coded base requirements to level up from a scattered village to a full-blown empire?
Because for a long time, the story we were told was that it was, all about building a spectacular world wonder.
Or achieving some grand moral enlightenment, right?
Yeah, or maybe inventing a specific tool.
But the research we're diving into today paints a very different picture.
A much more mechanical picture.
Right. Today we're asking a paradoxical question. Why did humans across 6 completely isolated parts of the globe all decide to invent taxes, middle managers, and traffic laws at the exact same time?
And to answer that, we really have to look past the romanticized myths of history and examine the raw mechanical logistics of human survival.
The data we're pulling from today is just phenomenal.
Oh, it's incredible. We're going to look at a statistical analysis of 186 different societies to find out the actual mathematical formula for a civilization.
We'll examine the 6 distinct, independent cradles of human society where this formula was discovered.
And we're going to use ancient Egypt as our masterclass case study to see how a civilization functions, basically, as a corporate monopoly.
Yes, and finally, we will uncover the incredibly mundane, unromantic reason humans were forced to invent the written word.
It's not what you'd expect.
Not at all. We are going to completely dismantle and rebuild your understanding of the blueprint of civilization today.
Let's do it.
So to find that blueprint, we actually need to go back to 1950.
Right, to Veer Gordon Childe.
Exactly. For decades, the archaeological gold standard for defining a civilization was based on his work. He published this massive paper on what he called the urban revolution.
He essentially created a 10-point checklist, right?
Yeah, a literal checklist for what makes a society civilized. It included things you would totally expect, huge urban centers, monumental public buildings.
Sophisticated art, exact sciences like geometry.
And writing. If you had big stone temples and people painting pottery, you were civilized.
Which, it sounds perfectly reasonable on the surface.
It does.
But human history is notoriously messy, and societies rarely follow a neat academic checklist.
No, they definitely don't. And that's where this fascinating piece of modern research by Nikolai N. Creighton comes in, challenging that old 1950s standard.
Creighton recognized that we needed to separate the optional side quests of human history from the absolute core requirement.
The required main storyline, basically.
Well, and to do this, he didn't just look at a few famous empires. He utilized this massive database published by George Murdoch and Katerina Provost.
The one that tracked 186 different societies across the globe?
Yes, exactly. They measured the cultural complexity of these groups using variables like fixity of residence, agriculture, urbanization.
Land transport, money, population density, social stratification. They tracked everything.
All of it. Creighton essentially ran the numbers to see which of those variables always show up together when a society successfully levels up.
He was looking for statistical correlations.
Exactly. And the numbers he found completely shifted the definition of civilization.
I love this part. When he cross-referenced all these societies, the strongest statistical relationship, what statisticians call an R value, was 0.72.
which is huge.
Yeah, just for context for the listener, an R value of 1.0 means two things are perfectly identical in their movement.
Like the correlation between the temperature in Celsius and Fahrenheit.
Right, and an R value of 0 is just random noise.
So 0.72 is an incredibly strong link.
And that link was between two very specific things. Political integration, meaning a formalized state hierarchy, and social stratification, meaning distinct classes of rich and poor.
The data reveals a pretty harsh truth, honestly. Yeah, it does. A society reaches the threshold of a true civilization, not when it paints beautiful frescoes or charts the stars, but specifically when it exhibits a complex stratification into 3 or more distinct social classes.
3 distinct classes.
Yeah, the origin of the state developed strictly in parallel with the formation of these classes. You need an elite ruling class, a managerial or specialized middle class, and a massive lower class of laborers.
You just cannot maintain a complex, settled society without that invisible structure of human management.
No, it's impossible. So to unlock those 3 social classes, the database shows a few absolute non-negotiable must-haves.
Right, the prerequisites.
Exactly. You need a permanent residence. Nomadic wandering just doesn't allow for a deep, permanent class system.
Makes sense.
You also need extensive agriculture as the bedrock of the economy. You need metalworking.
Wait, really? Every single one?
Every single society in the database with a 3-level class structure had metallurgists or smiths.
Wow.
And fascinatingly, you need wheeled transport.
Okay, but I have to push back on this rigid definition for a second.
Go for it.
If we say civilization requires a state apparatus, metalworking, and a 3-tier class system, what do we do with monuments like Stonehenge? Or the massive Moai statues on Easter Island?
That is the big question.
Right, because hauling 25-ton sarsen stones across the English countryside requires immense engineering, logistics, and thousands of people. Doesn't that level of coordination equal a civilization?
It's a brilliant point, and it's exactly where Creighton's analysis provides a major aha moment.
Okay, how so?
Creighton argues that we must reject monumental structures as the primary defining feature of civilization.
Because they lacked the state.
Exactly, because the majestic structures of Stonehenge or Easter Island were built by people operating without a formal state system or advanced metalworking.
So what are they then? Just flukes?
They're a symptom. They are a symptom of a society having just enough surplus food and just enough seasonal free time to convince or coerce people to drag heavy stones around instead of farming.
Oh, wow. So it's like a temporary flex.
Right. But the actual cause of a true, enduring civilization is the massive, permanent agricultural surplus combined with the rigid class structure that manages and controls that surplus year-round.
In other words, temporary coordination for a religious festival doesn't make an empire.
No, it doesn't.
The academic definition of civilization is essentially the invention of permanent management. It's the invention of systemic inequality.
Which is a bit dark, but statistically accurate.
But human ingenuity always finds a way to break the rules, right? And the data shows some incredible anomalies that I want to highlight.
Oh, the paradoxes are the best part.
Yeah, Creighton points out this stateless paradox. You can actually have a highly civilized, stratified society with brilliant writing and culture, but entirely lack an overarching state apparatus.
Like the ancient Greek city-state, the polis.
Exactly. Places like Athens or Sparta, they had intense class stratification and high culture, but they operated as independent, stateless communities for a long time.
They leveled up their culture and class systems, but completely ignored the political integration branch of the tech tree.
Right, they just skipped it.
Yeah.
And then we see the exact inverse with the great nomadic empires like the Khalkha-Mongols or the Kazakhs.
Well, they are fascinating.
They built immense multi-level political hierarchies. They conquered vast territories, organized massive armies, but agriculture made up less than 10% of their economy.
So they generated enormous political power without that deep 3-level class stratification of settled farmers.
Exactly. They built an empire on mobility rather than surplus.
It just shows humanity is playing the game, and there are multiple paths to victory.
Still, for the vast majority of human history, the most reliable, repeatable path, the blueprint, is to settle down, grow a massive amount of food, invent metalworking, and divide your people into at least 3 classes to manage the logistics of that food.
That's the meta strategy.
Right. So if that is the formula, where on the map did humans actually pull this off first?
Well, we all grew up with the old diffusion theory, right?
Yeah, the idea that civilization started in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia and then just slowly trickled out to the rest of the world.
Like ink spreading on paper through trade and migration.
Right, exactly. But modern scholarship has completely abandoned that theory, haven't they?
Entirely. The archaeological record now clearly shows that the blueprint of civilization was discovered independently in at least 6 different locations across the globe.
We call them the cradles of civilization.
And these were populations separated by oceans, mountains, and deserts, having absolutely no contact with one another.
None at all.
Yet they all arrived at the exact same systemic conclusions.
It's as if 6 different groups of people were locked in separate escape rooms across the planet.
I love that analogy.
They're all looking at different clues in the room, right? Different rivers, different plants, different climates. But they all figure out the exact same combination to unlock the door to civilization.
So let's look at the map of those 6 escape rooms.
We've got the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, the Nile Valley in Egypt, the Indo-Gangetic Plain in South Asia, the North China Plain, the Andean coast in Peru, and the Mesoamerican Gulf Coast.
And the first group to crack the code was in the Levant, part of the Fertile Crescent. And they actually started picking the lock before they even invented agriculture.
Wait, really? Before agriculture?
Yeah. Around 12,000 BC, a group known as the Natufian culture realized that if they settled near extremely abundant water sources, they could hunt, fish, and gather dense stands of wild cereals without having to constantly follow herds.
Oh, so they became sedentary hunter-gatherers.
Exactly. Which eventually evolved into the pre-pottery Neolithic cultures around 10,200 BC.
We are talking over 12,000 years ago. To put that in perspective for you listening, the site of Jericho in the Jordan Valley had initial settlements around 9600 BC.
And by 6800 BC, Jericho had massive stone walls and a stone tower nearly 30 feet high.
Which requires dedicated labor and engineering millennia before the pyramids.
Absolutely. And from there, the focus shifts east into Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
Which had incredibly fertile soil, but it required water management.
Right. During the Ubaid period, starting around 6500 BC, they developed intensive irrigated hydraulic agriculture.
They were digging networks of canals to bring water to the arid plains.
And this mastery of the environment led directly to the Uruk period, around 4000 BC. That's where we see true urban life, the emergence of priest kings, and the first hints of writing.
So while Mesopotamia was building canals, the second escape room was being solved in ancient India, specifically the Indus Valley.
Yes, the earliest reliably dated site is Mehrgarh in present-day Pakistan, dating to 7000 BC.
But the true marvel of the Indus Valley is the mature Harappan phase, around 2600 BC. Because when we look at their cities, like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, we see an obsession with urban planning that wouldn't be rivaled until the modern era.
Their sanitation systems are honestly mind-blowing.
They really are. If you walked through Mohenjo-Daro thousands of years ago, you wouldn't see the open sewers that plagued medieval European cities millennia later.
No, almost every individual home had its own private well for clean water.
And their bathing areas had sloped floors that directed wastewater into these incredibly sophisticated covered brick drains that lined the major streets.
They even had manhole covers for maintenance.
It's absurd how advanced they were. But beyond sanitation, their true indicator of centralized authority was their fanatical dedication to standardization.
Oh, the weights and measures.
Yes, they developed a system of uniform weights and measures that was identical across a massive territory of over 1 million square kilometers.
Which is a logistical nightmare to enforce.
Seriously, archaeologists actually found an ivory scale in Lothal with divisions of exactly 1.704 millimeters.
That is incredibly small.
It's the smallest division ever recorded on a scale from the Bronze Age. You don't create a society-wide measuring system precise to 1.7 millimeters unless you have a massive centralized bureaucracy auditing every grain of wheat and every copper tool being traded.
Right, that precision was their absolute strength. But unfortunately, their reliance on a specific climate was their downfall.
Oh, right, the Ghaggar-Hakra River system.
Yeah, the Indus Valley Civilization relied heavily on those rivers, which were entirely rain-fed by the seasonal monsoons.
And then the climate shifted.
Around 1800 BC, the monsoons weakened significantly, leading to severe aridification.
So the rivers literally began to dry up and retract.
And without the predictable water, their intensive agriculture just failed. The massive agricultural surplus vanished, the cities could no longer feed their dense populations, and the society decentralized, scattering eastward.
It's a stark reminder of how fragile these early civilizations were to geographic shifts. Geography gives, and geography takes away. Which brings us to the third cradle, ancient China. Their strategy for the escape room was slightly different, wasn't it?
Yeah, because it wasn't a single linear progression along one river. It was an interaction of different cultures along two massive, distinct river systems, the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze River in the south.
And the climate differences meant they domesticated entirely different crops.
Exactly. The Yangtze was wet and perfectly suited for cultivating rice around 6500 BC.
While the Yellow River Valley was drier, leading the Pilot Gang culture to focus on millet around 7000 BC.
And this dual engine of agriculture eventually coalesced into highly complex societies. By 1900 BC, we see the Urlitu culture, which is widely considered the first state-level society in East Asia.
And the physical labor required to build their cities was staggering. They constructed massive palatial complexes using a technique called rammed earth.
Which is backbreaking work.
Rammed earth is such a brutal, labor-intensive process. You essentially build a sturdy wooden frame, pour in a mixture of damp soil, gravel, and chalk, and then physically pound it down with heavy wooden tampers until it is rock solid.
And then you move the frame up and do it again.
Building massive palace walls this way requires thousands of laborers working in perfect synchronization.
The Urlitu culture also mastered intricate bronze casting, creating these incredible ritual vessels. And bronze wasn't just a metal for them. It was a symbol of state power.
Because controlling the copper and tin mines and the highly skilled artisans who could cast bronze was how the elite maintained their social stratification.
Exactly. Now, we've covered the Middle East, India, and China. All of them relied on massive river systems, and all of them relied on a staple cereal, grain, wheat, barley, rice, or millet.
But when we look at the Americas, we find civilizations that brute force the escape room lock by completely breaking Creighton's rules.
They really did. Let's travel to the Andean coast of ancient Peru and look at the Carol Supe, or Norte Chico, civilization.
They emerged around 3200 BC, right? Making them contemporaneous with the early pharaohs of Egypt.
Yes, and Norte Chico is the ultimate rule breaker.
Because if you remember Creighton's strict criteria for civilization, you need wheeled transport, metalworking, and extensive cereal agriculture.
Well, Norte Chico had absolutely no wheeled transport.
None.
They had no metalworking. They were a purely Stone Age society.
They didn't even have ceramics.
I know. Imagine a civilization building massive cities without a single clay pot to store water or grain.
And they had almost no visual art, no statues, no frescoes, yet they are undeniably one of the 6 original cradles of civilization.
Simply because of the sheer scale of their architecture. In the arid valleys of 3 small rivers, they constructed immense, terraced earthwork platform mounds and sprawling sunken circular plazas.
The city of Corral is a masterpiece of centralized authority.
But for a long time, archaeologists were completely baffled by how they generated the surplus calories required to build these mounds without a staple grain.
Right, because how do you feed an army of builders without wheat or rice?
This actually led to the maritime foundation hypothesis. Because they were located near the incredibly rich fisheries of the Pacific coast, the theory was that they built a civilization entirely on marine resources.
Essentially, an empire built on anchovies and sardines.
Exactly.
A pyramid built by a fish-based economy. It sounds impossible.
It does, but the current consensus shows it was an incredibly sophisticated, symbiotic trade network.
Okay, how did that work?
Well, the inland sites in the river valleys used irrigation to grow cotton, not food.
Oh, cotton.
Yeah, they took that cotton, wove it into massive fishing nets, and traded the nets to the coastal settlements.
And the coastal settlements used the nets to catch immense quantities of fish.
Which they dried and traded back inland for protein, cotton for fish.
That is brilliant. And because they didn't have writing or pottery, they managed this complex, society-wide supply chain using a recording system called the quipu.
The quipu is fascinating. It's a system of knotted strings made of cotton or camelid fiber. They would take a main cord and attach hundreds of pendant cords to it.
And by varying the color of the string, the type of knot, and the position of the knot on the cord, they could encode vast amounts of data.
It is effectively a textile computer.
Yeah, the knots were tied in a base 10 positional system, allowing them to record census data, tax obligations, and warehouse inventories of dried fish and cotton.
They achieved complex administration through textiles. It's just wild.
And our final cradle of civilization, Mesoamerica, also utilized a unique geographic environment.
Yes. The staple crop here, maize, was domesticated very early. around 7000 BC.
But because early maize cobs were tiny-like, barely the size of a human thumb, it took thousands of years of selective breeding before it could support a massive urban population.
Right. And around 1900 BC, we see groups like the Mokai beginning to develop hierarchical societies, largely centered around the domestication of cacao.
The source of chocolate.
Exactly, which was consumed as this bitter, elite beverage. But the true foundational mother culture of Mesoamerica is the Olmec civilization.
Which coalesced around 1400 BC along the Mesoamerican Gulf Coast. They lived in a dense, well-watered alluvial environment along the Quetzalcoatl's River,
That swampy, fertile land allowed for intense agricultural yields.
which immediately triggered the rise of an elite management class. And the Olmec elites really wanted to project their power visually.
Oh, they are famous for carving those massive, colossal stone heads out of basalt.
These heads weigh up to 40 tons. The logistical nightmare of moving a 40-ton boulder from the volcanic Tuxtla Mountains, dragging it 50 miles through dense, swampy jungle without the invention of the wheel.
And without draft animals like oxen or horses.
It's staggering. It requires thousands of laborers, massive wooden rafts, and unquestioned central authority.
And the Olmecs established the cultural blueprint that would define Mesoamerica for millennia. They built major ceremonial centers like San Lorenzo and La Venta, featuring massive earthen pyramids.
They introduced complex calendar systems, the famous Mesoamerican ritual ball game, and the practice of ritual bloodletting.
Where elites would pierce their own skin to offer blood to the gods to ensure agricultural fertility.
So, bringing this all back to Creighton's statistical analysis, we have looked at 6 different escape rooms.
Right.
Whether it's the Olmecs growing maize in a jungle, the Chinese pounding rammed earth to protect millet, the Mesopotamians digging canals for wheat, or the Norte Chico trading cotton for fish.
The underlying mechanical engine of human progress is identical.
A geographical sweet spot creates an environment where an agricultural surplus is possible.
That surplus allows humans to stop wandering and build dense, permanent cities.
And the sheer friction of thousands of people living on top of each other demands a hierarchy.
The elites take control of the surplus, they build monuments to legitimize their power, and they invent systems to track the resources.
To truly understand the daily logistics of how all these gears of geography, surplus, and hierarchy interlock to run a massive empire, we need to put one specific cradle under the microscope.
We need a masterclass in state control.
Let's zoom in on the Nile Valley. Let's look at ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt is the absolute perfect illustration of a civilization operating as an all-powerful corporate monopoly.
It really is. But to understand the Egyptian state, you have to understand that their entire reality, their economy, their religion, their class structure was entirely dictated by a single geographical feature, the Nile River.
It is the ultimate geographical sweet spot.
Yes. The Nile is the lifeline of Northeast Africa. But it wasn't always a desert oasis.
Right. During the pre-dynastic period, thousands of years before the pharaohs, the climate in North Africa was vastly different.
It was a savanna environment, full of grazing animals and nomadic herders.
But slowly, a massive climate shift occurred. The region experienced severe aridification, and the Sahara Desert began to form.
As the grasslands turned to sand, the scattered human populations were forced to migrate and compress themselves along the permanent water source of the Nile.
That compression forced innovation. By 5500 BC, we see small tribes developing into dedicated farming communities. We have the Fayum A culture and later the Badarian culture in Upper Egypt.
And just a quick geographic note for the listener. Upper Egypt is actually the southern part of the country, and Lower Egypt is the north, near the Mediterranean.
Right, because the Nile flows south to north.
Exactly. So the Badarians were making high-quality ceramics and beginning to use copper. This evolves into the Naqada culture, which spans over 1,000 years.
If you walked through an Naqada village, you would see a society rapidly leveling up. They were transitioning from mud huts to organized towns.
They were importing obsidian from Ethiopia, establishing long-distance trade routes with Mesopotamia, and beginning to use early visual symbols on pottery.
This culmination of wealth and population density led to inevitable conflict and consolidation. Finally, around 3150 BC, a king named Narmer, often identified with the legendary figure Menes, successfully conquered and united Upper and Lower Egypt into a single massive kingdom.
Which marks the beginning of the early dynastic period and the creation of the ultimate centralized state.
The pharaoh became the absolute monarch, a living god on earth, and the state functioned as a massive, intricate administration.
The pharaoh was assisted by a vizier, essentially the chief operating officer of the empire, who managed the land surveys, the treasury, the massive building projects, and the legal system.
The entire country was divided into 42 administrative regions called nomes, each governed by a regional manager called a nomarch.
This is Creighton's political integration fully realized. But the state's power was entirely dependent on managing the agricultural surplus.
Because the Egyptians literally structured their calendar, their economy, and their lives around the river's three distinct seasons.
The first was Akhet, the season of inundation, lasting roughly from June to September.
The Nile, fed by monsoon rains in the Ethiopian highlands, would overflow its banks, flooding the valley and depositing a thick layer of rich, dark, mineral-laden silt.
It was nature's perfect fertilizer, delivered automatically on a massive scale every single year.
But during Akhet, the fields were underwater, so the farmers couldn't farm.
And this is the period when the state enacted the corvée labor system.
The pharaoh would draft the idle farming population to work on state projects, hauling stones for temples, clearing irrigation canals, or building pyramids.
Exactly as the floodwaters receded, the second season began. Peret, the growing season from October to February.
The farmers would take their wooden plows, often pulled by oxen, and churn the incredibly fertile mud, planting seeds of emmer wheat and barley.
They managed a complex network of ditches and catch basins to trap the retreating water for irrigation.
And finally came Shamu, the harvesting season from March to May. Entire communities would mobilize, using flint sickles to cut the grain, threshing it by having animals trample it, and winnowing it in the wind.
This grain was then ground into flour for bread and fermented into thick, nutritious beer. Bread and beer were the absolute foundational staples of Egyptian life.
Now here's where the logistics of the empire get truly fascinating for me. How did they manage the buying, selling, and taxation of this bread and beer without money?
Right, because Egypt is the perfect proof that you don't need coins to run a complex economy.
Coinage didn't exist in Egypt until the late period, thousands of years after the pyramids were built.
Instead, they operated on a highly strict, centrally organized money barter system.
The common denominators of value were standard sacks of grain and a specific unit of weight called the daben.
A daben was a standardized weight of roughly 91 grams of copper or silver. And the genius of the Egyptian state was that the prices of literally everything in the country were fixed by the central government.
And recorded in master lists to facilitate trading.
Yes. So if I am an Egyptian craftsman and I want to buy a linen shirt, I don't hand the merchant a copper coin.
The master list says a shirt is worth 5 copper daben.
Right. So I can hand the merchant anything I own, a wooden bed, a jar of beer, a woven basket, or a sack of grain, as long as the total value of those items equals exactly 5 daben of copper.
I could buy a cow, which cost 140 daben, by trading a combination of furniture and grain equal to that exact weight.
It is a completely cashless, ledger-based economy, and wages were equally standardized.
A simple laborer working on a state project earned about 5.5 sacks of grain a month. A foreman earned 7.5 sacks.
And the state, or the massive temple complexes, which functioned as extensions of the state, owned the vast majority of the agricultural land.
They collected the surplus grain as taxes, stored it in massive fortified granary complexes, and then physically redistributed it to the population as wages.
So let's crystallize this analogy. The state owns all the land. The state dictates the fixed prices for every single item in the economy.
The state holds all the food in central treasuries.
And the state exacts labor taxes, drafting citizens during the flood season to build monuments.
Ancient Egypt was essentially a massive, incredibly successful corporate monopoly where the CEO is a living god, the regional managers enforce the quotas, and the millions of employees are paid strictly in bread and beer.
That is an incredibly accurate way to view it. The pharaoh's power was wrapped in divine mythology, but practically it was purely logistical.
Because controlling the granaries in a harsh desert environment meant controlling life and death.
The ability to mobilize 100,000 peasants to build the Great Pyramid of Giza during the Old Kingdom wasn't just a religious exercise. It was the ultimate flex of the state's economic control.
They were effectively saying, we have so much surplus grain stored away, we can afford to feed a massive percentage of our population to drag limestone blocks across the desert for 20 years, and no one will starve.
Exactly. But a CEO cannot run a corporate monopoly of that unprecedented scale alone.
No, you can't just have the pharaoh at the top and millions of farmers at the bottom. You need a dedicated class of middle management.
And that brings us perfectly to the very people who kept the corporate monopoly of Egypt running. This is the crucial three-level stratification that Creighton argued is the true marker of civilization. Let's look at the social pyramid of Egypt.
The social stratification was rigid and explicitly displayed in daily life. At the very bottom, making up the vast bulk of the population, perhaps 80 to 90%, were the farmers.
They worked the land owned by the state, the temples, or noble families.
Above them were the artists and craftsmen. They had higher status and better living conditions, but they were still heavily under state control.
Working in large workshops attached to temples, and paid directly from the state treasury to produce jewelry, statues, and furniture for the elite.
And at the very top, just below the pharaoh and the vizier, were the scribes and the officials. They were famously known as the white kilt class.
I absolutely love this detail.
It's so good. They wore bleached, pristine, white linen garments. It was a deliberate, immediate visual signifier of their rank in society.
It proved to everyone on the street that they did not do dirty, sweaty manual labor in the muddy fields.
They were the administrators, the accountants, the engineers, calculating the geometry of the pyramids, the physicians, and the priests.
The white kilt is basically the ancient Egyptian equivalent of the Silicon Valley Patagonia fleece vest.
Exactly. It says, I work with abstract information, not with my hands.
A perfect modern translation. This white kilt class was often granted sprawling estates by the king as payment for their loyal service, which entrenched them as a powerful nobility.
But how does a small elite class enforce their rule over millions of peasant farmers for thousands of years? You cannot just rely on violence or the threat of the military.
No, violence is expensive, exhausting, and inherently unstable.
To maintain a civilization long-term, you need an ideology. You need the farmers to fundamentally believe in the system.
You need an ancient HR department to manage company culture.
In Egypt, that overarching ideology was a concept called ma'at.
Ma'at is often translated as cosmic order, truth, balance, and justice.
The Egyptians believed that the universe was constantly under threat from chaos, and it was the duty of every citizen, from the pharaoh down to the lowest farmer, to maintain ma'at.
The entire legal system was based on it. It wasn't a complicated set of rigid, written statutes like the Code of Hammurabi in Mesopotamia. It was a common-sense view of right and wrong.
Focused on reaching agreements, mediating disputes, and resolving conflicts so that the cosmic balance of the community was maintained.
When it came to everyday justice, they operated at a very localized level. Towns had councils of elders called the kenbet.
These local councils handled minor disputes, small claims, and petty theft.
For serious crimes, murder, major land disputes, or the ultimate crime of tomb robbery cases were escalated to the Great Kenbet, which was presided over by the vizier, or sometimes the pharaoh himself.
The process was quite direct. Plaintiffs and defendants represented themselves. There were no lawyers.
They had to swear a solemn oath to the gods to tell the truth.
And the state acted as both the prosecutor and the judge. And yes, while the goal was restoring balance, the state did employ physical beatings with sticks to extract confessions from suspects or witnesses.
Scribes meticulously documented every complaint, testimony, and verdict on papyrus.
If you were found guilty of a minor crime, the punishments were swift fines, public beatings, or in some cases facial mutilation like cutting off the nose.
Serious crimes like tomb robbery, which threatened the eternal soul of the elite, resulted in execution, decapitation, drowning, or impalement.
But the legal system evolved in a truly bizarre way. By the New Kingdom period, the system started relying heavily on divine oracles.
The use of oracles is a fascinating psychological tool of statecraft.
How did it work?
For civil or even criminal cases, the community would gather outside a temple. The priests would bring out a statue of a god, carrying it on a wooden bar, resting on their shoulders.
Okay, wow.
The judge or the plaintiff would ask the statue a yes or no question. For example, did this man steal the copper tools?
Just picture the scene. You have the entire village gathered around. The priests, who are members of the elite white kilt class, are balancing this heavy golden statue on their shoulders.
And the god renders judgment by supposedly forcing the priests to physically move.
If the god wants to say yes, the sheer divine weight forces the priests to stumble forward. If no, they stumble backward.
Sometimes the statue would be brought before two pieces of papyrus with different verdicts written on them, and the priests would be physically drawn to point at one of them.
It is an incredibly powerful, manipulative tool for the elite to maintain order. They can literally say, it's not the state sentencing you to hard labor. The god physically moved us and demanded it.
It removed the burden of judgment from the human administrators and placed it on the infallible divine order.
But while the state was incredibly controlling, the social dynamics regarding individual rights were astonishingly progressive, especially regarding gender.
That is something a lot of people don't realize.
I was shocked reading the source material on this. If you look at ancient Greece or the Roman Empire, women were essentially treated as perpetual minors.
They were under the strict legal control of their fathers and then their husbands. They couldn't easily own property or participate in business.
But the ancient Egyptians viewed men and women as essentially equal under the eyes of the law. Even a female peasant could petition the vizier's court for redress.
Women in ancient Egypt had a level of legal autonomy that wouldn't be seen in many Western countries until the 20th century.
A woman could go to court on her own behalf.
She had the right to own, manage, and sell real estate and slaves. She could make binding financial contracts, execute wills, and receive inheritances.
If she worked outside the home, she received the exact same grain rations as a man doing the same job.
They even had complex marriage contracts. Marriage in Egypt wasn't a religious sacrament. It was a civil, financial arrangement.
These contracts were specifically designed to protect the woman financially. They stipulated the exact property she brought into the marriage and detailed the husband's strict financial obligations to provide for her and the children if he ever initiated a divorce.
And women could initiate divorce themselves, simply by stating they no longer wish to be married, taking their original property and a portion of the joint wealth with them.
And of course, at the very pinnacle of society, women like Hatshepsut completely shattered the glass ceiling by ruling not just as a queen consort, but as a full-fledged pharaoh, donning the false beard of authority and commanding the absolute corporate monopoly of Egypt.
It is a remarkable society. But to return to Creighton's blueprint, we have a massively successful society, a perfect engine of grain generation, managed by a pristine class of scribes backed by the cosmic law of Ma'at.
But the absolute superpower of the white kilt class, the single technological tool that allowed them to track the hundreds of thousands of sacks of grain, audit the copper debit, organize the corvée labor taxes, and maintain the corporate monopoly, was their exclusive grip on a brand new invention.
Which brings us to one of Gordon Child's original requirements for civilization, and arguably the most important intellectual leap in human history, the invention of writing.
When most of us think about the invention of writing, we imagine a highly romanticized scenario.
We picture an ancient poet yearning to record the Epic of Gilgamesh for future generations.
Or a group of devout priests realizing they need to write down the complex mythology of the gods before it's forgotten. We assume writing was invented to capture the human soul.
The archaeological reality is entirely devoid of romance.
Writing was not invented to write poetry.
Writing was invented to do accounting.
Yes.
If Creighton's statistical analysis proves anything, it's that complex class societies require advanced, rigorous administration.
You simply cannot run a nationwide grain monopoly from memory.
You cannot remember who paid their taxes and who didn't across 42 different provinces. You need an archive.
And this brings us to a recent, fascinating piece of research from the Smithsonian regarding the origins of the world's very first writing system in Mesopotamia.
We were talking about cuneiform, the system of wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay tablets.
It emerged around 3100 BC. But before full, complex cuneiform, there was an earlier, simpler system called proto-cuneiform, used around 3350 BC.
For a long time, historians looked at these early clay tablets and wondered where the specific symbols came from. Humans didn't just wake up one Tuesday and arbitrarily decide that a triangle meant wheat.
To solve this mystery, researchers at the University of Bologna looked back even further in time, long before writing existed. They examined artifacts known as cylinder seals.
These were small, intricately carved stone cylinders, usually about an inch long. They date back to between 4400 and 3400 BCE.
For thousands of years, pre-literate merchants and administrators used these physical seals to keep track of goods.
So here is how a cylinder seal actually worked in practice.
Imagine you are a Mesopotamian merchant. You have a large clay jar filled with expensive olive oil and you want to ship it down the river.
You cover the top of the jar with a piece of cloth, tie it with string, and then pack a lump of wet clay over the knot.
Then you take your personal carved cylinder seal and physically roll it across the wet clay.
It leaves a highly detailed, unique, continuous image pressed into the clay.
Once the clay dries, it acts as a tamper-evident seal and a signature. If the seal is broken when the jar arrives, you know someone stole your oil.
Exactly. They were physical tracking tokens. But the researchers from Bologna did something ingenious.
They systematically compared the pre-literate images carved onto these ancient cylinder seals with the abstract symbols used centuries later in proto-cuneiform writing.
And they found exact one-to-one matches.
I am looking at the visual comparisons in the research right now, and it completely blew my mind. The symbols they matched aren't majestic drawings of kings or eagles or gods. One of the matches is quite literally a drawing of a fringed piece of cloth. Another exact match is a drawing of a vessel wrapped inside a netting.
In both the physical cylinder seals and the later written clay tablets, these specific symbols referred to the transport and sale of textile and agricultural goods.
It is the ultimate proof of the logistical necessity of writing.
As the cities in Mesopotamia grew into massive urban centers like Uruk, the sheer volume of trade, the massive agricultural surplus, and the complexity of the supply chain became too overwhelming to track with just physical clay tokens and jar seals.
The administrators reached a point of absolute information overload.
They needed a faster, more abstract way to record hundreds of daily transactions. So they took the familiar physical symbols from the cylinder seals and started drawing them directly onto flat clay tablets.
The pre-literate tracking symbol became a written character. The symbols carried their semantic meaning from the physical world into the abstract world of writing.
It's brilliant in its simplicity.
It is honestly a little hilarious and maybe a tiny bit disappointing that the single greatest intellectual leap in human history was basically invented by stressed-out middle managers desperately trying to generate shipping receipts for fringed blankets and jars of oil.
When it makes perfect logistical sense. And we see a very similar evolution of efficiency in our masterclass Cradle of Egypt.
Indeed. Egyptian hieroglyphs emerged shortly after, around 3000 BC. We can trace their early precursors to symbols painted on Gurzian pottery during the Naqada culture.
Now, when we say hieroglyphs, everyone immediately pictures the beautiful, incredibly intricate, formal carvings of birds and eyes and scarabs on the walls of stone temples and inside the tombs of the pharaohs.
But those formal stone carvings are incredibly time-consuming. You cannot chisel a perfectly proportioned ibis into a limestone block every single time a farmer pays his tax of 5 sacks of grain.
The white kilt class needed speed. They needed efficiency to run the corporate monopoly.
So the Egyptian scribes developed a cursive, everyday form of writing called hieratic.
Instead of chiseling stone, they used a reed brush dipped in carbon ink to quickly paint simplified versions of the hieroglyphs onto papyrus scrolls.
It allowed for rapid administrative recording, and the drive for efficiency didn't stop there.
By the late period, they developed an even faster, more heavily abbreviated and streamlined script called demotic.
It was the shorthand of the ancient world, used for legal documents, receipts, and daily letters.
And it is precisely because of that bureaucratic need for speed and the creation of demotic that we can actually read Egyptian history today.
It all comes back to the Rosetta Stone.
For over 1,000 years, formal hieroglyphs were a completely dead, unreadable language.
But when Napoleon's troops found the Rosetta Stone in 1799, it was the ultimate cryptographic key.
The stone, which is essentially just a mundane tax decree issued in 1906 BC, had the exact same text written 3 different times on the same block.
The top portion was written in formal, sacred hieroglyphs. The middle portion was written in everyday, administrative demotic.
And the bottom portion was written in ancient Greek, because the ruling dynasty at the time was Greek.
Because scholars in the 1820s could easily read the ancient Greek, they could use it to translate the demotic, and then use the demotic to finally crack the phonetic code of the hieroglyphs.
The administrative bureaucracy literally left us the dictionary.
If we pull back and look at the entire journey we have taken today, from Gordon Child's checklist to Creighton's statistical R values, the shipping receipt is the ultimate, inevitable culmination of the civilization formula.
Think about the chain of causality we have mapped out.
Let's trace it from the beginning. It starts with geography. A perfectly situated river valley or a shifting climate creates the potential for a massive agricultural surplus.
Humans figure out how to dig the canals or breed the maize, and that surplus allows them to stop wandering and build permanent, dense settlements.
That unprecedented density of human beings creates immense social friction.
To survive that density, the society requires a rigid division of labor. Creighton's 3-tier class stratification emerges to manage the population.
The elite management class seizes control of the surplus grain or the bronze foundries to maintain their power.
And to effectively wield that power, To manage the logistics of 100,000 people without the system collapsing into chaos, they invent administration.
The physical cylinder seal rolled on a jar of oil evolves into an abstract symbol drawn on a clay tablet.
The tablet is stored in a state archive.
The written word allows for complex legal codes like Mott, and those legal codes organize the massive peasant class to dig more canals and grow more food.
It is a completely self-sustaining circular engine.
And that engine leads us to a profound realization about the legacy of civilization itself. To be civilized, according to the cold, hard data of human history, is not about achieving a state of grand moral enlightenment.
It is not about reaching a pinnacle of artistic expression.
Strictly speaking, it is the mechanical, logistical process of settling down, producing a surplus, dividing society into those who labor in the dirt and those who manage the ledgers, and inventing the administrative tools to keep track of it all.
Whether it's the Nile River flooding perfectly on schedule, an Indus Valley engineer standardizing a brick, or a Mesopotamian merchant inventing a symbol for a fringed blanket, human history is fundamentally driven by the relentless logistics of survival and organization.
Which leaves me with a final provocative thought for you to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive.
Let's hear it.
We have seen that the very first writing systems, the ultimate tool of the elite, were invented purely because early empires reached a point of information overload.
The sheer volume of their grain and textiles forced a massive cognitive leap from physical tokens to abstract written language.
It was a technological leap forced by an administrative crisis. So where does that leave us today?
That's a huge question.
Think about the world we live in right now. Our modern global civilization is currently drowning in unprecedented, incomprehensible volumes of digital data.
Every single day, we generate more data than the entirety of human history combined prior to the digital age.
We have far surpassed our biological, neurological capacity to track the surplus of our modern world using traditional reading and writing.
We really have.
Are we, right now, standing on the exact same precipice the Mesopotamians stood on 5,000 years ago? Are we on the verge of needing a new, entirely alien method of communication and societal organization just to manage the overload?
Will artificial intelligence be to us what proto-cuneiform was to the ancient merchants of Uruk?
And if so, what will our modern cylinder seals look like to archaeologists digging through our servers 5,000 years from now, trying to understand how we finally leveled up?
It makes you wonder if we are just completing one era and starting the very next phase of the grand tech tree.
It really does. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope it completely dismantled and rebuilt the way you look at the complex, deeply mechanical foundations of the world around you. Keep digging, keep questioning the hidden mechanics of the game we are all playing, and we will catch you next time.